Okay, so the first thing that's new to talk about today actually is something that we've already done, elasticity versus relative elasticity, okay, which is a new topic technically because I didn't talk about it last time, but it's also a good way to review what we did last time. Okay, so last time what I showed you was that elasticity varies along a linear demand curve. I just got this right spot. There we go. Okay, so previously we showed that elasticity varies along a linear demand curve. Okay, so in particular, what we did was we took a demand curve like this, okay, with quantity and price. Here was the demand curve, okay, and we divided it into segments, okay. There was a segment up here that was elastic, okay, where the price falls and total revenue goes up, okay. There was a point here that was unit elastic, okay, and then there was a segment here that was inelastic. Along every single linear demand curve satisfies this, okay. And then in this inelastic portion, so in this elastic portion, as the price falls, total revenue rises. And in the inelastic portion, as the price falls, total revenue falls. Okay. Now, we also said, though, earlier when I talked about like the motivation of elasticity and how we classify elastic, unit elastic, and inelastic, that when we say a demand curve is elastic, we mean that it's relatively flat. So while we did separate a linear demand curve like this, yet we also identified elastic demand curves, those that are relatively flat because it's responsive to price. So when there's a change in price, there's a large change in quantity, and inelastic demand curves, which are relatively steep. And inelastic demand curves, which are steep. Okay, so in other words, what we did was we took two demand curves and we effectively compared them. Okay, so we said those that were relatively flat like this are elastic, and those that are relatively steep like this are inelastic. So how do we reconcile this idea? Because we know that on each of these demand curves, for example, on the inelastic demand curve, even though we're calling it inelastic, we know that there's an elastic segment up here and an inelastic segment down here. So how do we reconcile this idea? We reconcile this idea by referring to this comparative sense of elasticity, comparing two demand curves, as the relative elasticity. Okay, so when we do this, we are referring to a curves. Let me make sure. I don't know if the chat is gonna. Oh shit. Okay, that's just Tyler. Okay, we are referring to a curves relative elasticity. Okay. Now, the word relative there should give you the sense that we're using this sense of elasticity to compare two curves, not to necessarily point at a specific point on the demand curve and say whether or not it is technically elastic or inelastic. All right. So, for example, then, when we say that a curve is relatively elastic, okay, that is us saying that it is flat. The curve is flat relative to another curve. So up here, for example, you can see that this curve here is relatively elastic. In other words, when we say relatively elastic, that only makes sense if we have a curve to compare it to. You see what I mean? Yes, when a curve is relatively elastic like this one, we know that there's an elastic, unit elastic, and inelastic portion on that curve. But by saying it's relatively elastic, then we're saying that at every point on that curve, it's more elastic than some other curve. Okay, that's the idea. So then similarly, when we say a curve is relatively inelastic, okay, what we are saying is that the curve is steep relative to another curve. Relative to another curve. Okay, so these words relatively elastic or relatively inelastic are comparison terms. We use them when there are multiple curves and we're trying to figure out which is more elastic than another. So the whole point of this is that it allows us to comment on the overall price sensitivity of a demand curve relative to some other curve, while still recognizing that the curve has an elastic, unit elastic, and inelastic segment. Okay, so identifying a curve as relatively elastic or inelastic allows us to compare the overall price sensitivity of different demand curves while recognizing that every oh boy, every linear demand curve has elastic and inelastic segments. Inelastic segments. Okay, that's the idea. So when we say a curve is relatively elastic or relatively inelastic, that's a comparison term. It allows us to point to two demand curves like these and say, look, one is more elastic than the other, right? While recognizing that it's going to have an inelastic segment. Does that idea kind of make sense to everybody?
Yes.
Okay, so relatively elastic is a comparison term. All right, next thing I'm going to talk about is other elasticities of demand. Other elasticities of demand. So again, price elasticity of demand is but one example of an elasticity. We know there are relationships between various other things, even as it relates to quantity demanded. Yes, there's a relationship between price and quantity demanded, but there's also a relationship between, say, income and quantity demanded, and there's also relationships between the prices of other goods, like complements and substitutes, and quantity demanded. Okay, so I'm going to talk about two other elasticities of demand. The first is called the cross elasticity of demand, which you sometimes see referred to as the cross price elasticity, okay, which we denote with EAB. And this is because this is defined as the responsiveness of the quantity demanded of good A to the price of good B. To the price of good B. So if you think of substitutes and complements, for example, how responsive is the quantity demanded of Xboxes to the price of PlayStations, right? We're talking about the relationship between different goods here. So we define it in the exact same way as you would define, I guess technically there's a comma there, as you would define any elasticity as the percentage change in quantity demanded for good A divided by the percentage change in the price of good B, which in this case would be like PlayStations or something. Okay. Now, when we do price elasticity of demand, we know that because of the law of demand, the computed value of the price elasticity of demand is always negative, right? So we just take the absolute value because the sign means nothing. We put the sign in the interpretation, okay? With the cross elasticity of demand, the sign, whether it's positive or negative, matters, okay? If it's positive, that tells us when the price of one good goes up, the quantity demanded of the other goes up, which is exactly what we know happens when goods are substitutes, okay? So substitutes, meaning A and B are substitutes. So Xbox and PlayStation, okay, will have a positive cross elasticity. Okay, when the price of PlayStations goes up, I buy more Xboxes. Okay, that means that they're substitutes. Complements would be the opposite. Peanut butter and jelly, hot dogs and hot dog buns. If the price of peanut butter goes up, I buy less jelly, right? So a negative cross elasticity, A and B, indicates that the goods are complements. Okay. Finally, if there's zero, then the goods are unrelated. Unrelated, you get zero. Right? So if the price of socks goes up, what happens to the quantity demanded of ramen noodles? Probably nothing. Okay, probably zero, or at least close enough to zero, right? So that's cross elasticity of demand. All right. Then we have income elasticity of demand. Elasticity of demand. And the income elasticity of demand is the responsiveness. Oops, that line went like right through there. It's fine. Responsiveness of the quantity demanded to a change in income. Okay. You define it the exact same way as you would define any elasticity, right? The elasticity, income elasticity of demand, is the percentage change in quantity demanded divided by the percentage change in income, which we denote with a little y. In macro, you do big Y because it's aggregate income. In micro, sometimes people denote income. In micro, sometimes people denote income with a lowercase y. Okay. Now, again, here the sign matters because we have some goods that are the demand is increasing in income, right? And those goods are, of course, called normal goods. Okay. A normal good is going to be one where the income elasticity of demand is positive. As income goes up, you buy more of it. And then you have an inferior good that is the opposite. Right? So here the sign matters. Just like with the cross elasticity. Okay. So this is kind of, I'll be honest with you. These concepts here are kind of just bookkeeping. Like I do them to complete the circuit, but as you saw, if you looked at the problem set, my asking of these things is kind of pitiful because I think like the main concept of elasticity as we apply it for price elasticity of demand, the way it's measured, the way it's interpreted, how you calculate it using the midpoint formula, all that stuff applies to any elasticity. So we can kind of just define these things and then move on, right? Now, another thing that we can define and move on is price elasticity of supply. So just like there's a price elasticity of demand, you can also define the price elasticity of supply. Now you will see that this is exactly the same. It's exactly analogous to how we did for demand. So price elasticity of supply, which we define or we abbreviate as ES, is the responsiveness of quantity supplied, almost wrote demanded out of force of habit, to a change in price. So it's literally just the elasticity of the supply curve. That's all it is. You would define it the exact same way. Okay, percentage change in quantity supplied divided by the percentage change in price. Okay. Now here, because of the law of supply, we know that supply curves are upward sloping. So as the price goes up, we always know that quantity supplied is going to go up as well. So here, unlike with the price elasticity of demand, which is always negative, the law of supply implies that the price elasticity of supply is positive. So there's no need to take any absolute values or anything like that because it's automatically positive. Okay. Now, we can kind of like the way that you classify this number is the exact same as you do for demand, right? So you classify it as elastic, inelastic, or unit elastic, depending on where the value falls relative to 1. Okay, so when we did elastic demand, we said, look, elastic demand is what happens when this elasticity is greater than 1 and less than infinity. The exact same thing happens here. So elastic supply is what you get when the elasticity exceeds 1 and is less than infinity. So in this case, again, there's going to be a change in quantity supplied that exceeds the change in price. Okay, so if there's a 1% increase in the price, quantity supplied is going to increase by even more, by 4% or something. Okay. Now, when you reach infinity, that's perfectly elastic. Perfectly elastic. Okay. In this case, it effectively means the price cannot change, right? There is only one price, and firms will supply however many units at that one single price. Okay. So I'll draw these in a minute. And then you have inelastic supply, which follows the exact same convention, being between 0 and 1. Okay. And then, of course, perfectly inelastic. Perfectly inelastic would be what happens if it was exactly equal to 0. Right? In other words, the percentage change in quantity is 0, and therefore it's vertical. Again, I'll draw these in 1 second. But I'm kind of going through this quickly because if you look at how we did demand, it's the exact same idea here. Okay. And then unit elastic is what happens when it equals 1. Okay. So let me draw these really quick. Let me just take a second and make sure everybody's got this down. Good. So I know I flew through that, but again, it's exactly the same thing that we just did for demand. You just cross out supply and the little s and demand, and it's the exact same classifications. Okay. So when we draw these, I guess probably the graphs are almost more important because it allows you to kind of make sense of what's going on here. So if we draw a graph of supply, quantity, price, then elastic is going to be one that's quite sensitive to price. So when there's an increase in the price, quantity increases by a lot. So an elastic supply curve is going to look like this. This is supply elastic. An inelastic supply curve is going to look something like this. Okay. Perfectly elastic supply curve is going to be like this. And then perfectly inelastic is going to be vertical. I tried to make all these go through the same point. Pretend that it's perfect. Supply. Perfectly inelastic. Okay. Now, again, technically speaking, except for perfectly inelastic and perfectly elastic, when I write like S inelastic or S elastic, properly it would be relatively elastic, right? Like you're comparing two curves, but the whole relatively elastic thing is another one of those like language things where if you said to somebody supply is elastic, they would know what you meant. They would know that you meant that the supply curve was relatively flat. I mean, they wouldn't yell at you and say, do you mean relatively elastic? I mean, everybody knows what I mean. Like that relative term is something that you add to be careful of what you're talking about. But if you just said inelastic or elastic supply, everybody would know exactly what you're talking about. Okay, that's basically the idea. Okay. So very similar graphs. And then the determinants of this. So I'll just go through the determinants quickly, and then we'll move on to the really important thing of the day. Determinants of price elasticity. I'll be honest with you, these are kind of a little bit lame. Okay. The first one is time. Just like with price elasticity of demand, the more time that a firm has to adjust output in response to a price change, the more that they can adjust output, right? If a firm has already sent all of their units to market and the price goes up, they can't do anything about that. Okay. So the more time that a firm has to adjust output, or time to adjust output, that makes the supply curve more elastic. If a firm has a year to adjust output, they know that an increase in the price, they can really increase output, right? Where if they only have a week, then an increase in the price, it doesn't allow them to change output that much because they've already sent those things to market, right? The second is production capacity. Again, these are kind of lame. I'm not going to lie. Production capacity, basically, if a firm has more unused capacity, then when the price rises, they have a greater ability to expand output. Kind of makes sense, right? If a firm is already at capacity and the price goes up, they can't really expand output in the short run, at least. Capacity. Elastic. And last but least is input availability. Input availability. If inputs are more available, right, then it's very similar to production capacity. If inputs are more widely available, then if there's an increase in the price of some good that requires that input, it would be easier to expand production. But if it's very hard to get that input, right, if there's a shortage of that input at a given time, or that input is very expensive or whatever, right, or there's legal hurdles to getting that input, then it doesn't allow you to expand capacity that much, or output, I should say. So higher input availability makes it easier to expand output in response to a price increase. So we would say that it is more elastic. Okay. Like I would call those kind of lame, but whatever. Okay, it's kind of, again, for completion. Okay, so now we start the heavy hitter of the day, which is talking about taxes. Okay, taxes are going to be an important concept here. So does anybody have any questions on this stuff before I move on to talking about taxes? And again, taxes is going to be, you're probably wondering, like, why are we going to talk about taxes right now? It seems kind of random to like throw taxes in on the elasticity unit. But as you're going to see, the way that taxes are paid depends crucially on the elasticities of supply and demand. Okay, you'll develop an appreciation for that in a minute. But basically, taxes provide a good application of understanding, like, what are the implications and effects of different elasticities of supply and demand. Okay, so I think this is mostly definitions and stuff so far. So I don't see any questions in the chat, so I'm going to move on. Okay, taxes. Okay, so here's the thing about taxes, is that in economics, when we talk about taxes, there is a difference between what we call legal tax incidence and what we call economic tax incidence. Okay. The legal incidence of a tax may not align with the economic incidence. Okay, this sentence means absolutely nothing to you because you don't know what I mean by legal and economic incidence. So legal incidence refers to who pays the government. Legal tax incidence refers to who pays the government. Refers to who pays the government. So suppose, for example, that the government decides to put a tax on the production of cars. Okay, so every time Ford makes a truck, they have to pay a little bit of money to the government. Okay, or every time that the gas station sells a carton of cigarettes, a very common tax placed on a specific good, they have to send some money to the government. That firm then has the legal tax incidence. When they sell a car, when they sell a carton of cigarettes, whatever, they have to pay money to the government. That's the legal incidence. Economic tax incidence is what we actually care about because it's who actually bears the burden of that tax. Economic tax incidence refers to who ultimately bears the burden of the tax. Bears the burden of the tax. Now, the best example I can give of this is suppose that the government puts a tax on cigarettes. So every time that the gas station sells a carton of cigarettes, they have to send $2 to the government, just for example. Okay. The legal tax incidence is the gas station because for every carton they sell, they pay the government. Okay. The economic tax incidence might be the consumer because the gas station, in response to the tax, might raise the price and thereby pass the burden of that tax on to consumers. You see what I mean? So there's a difference between legal and economic tax incidence. Now, again, the difference between these two things and the ability of a firm to pass the legal tax incidence onto consumers is going to depend on the elasticity of supply and demand. Okay, if demand is very inelastic, that means that consumers are very insensitive to price changes. So firms can raise the price without suffering a change in quantity. That means it will be easy for a firm to pass off taxes in the form of higher prices. You see what I mean? Right? I'm going to dig into this with a lot more detail, but the idea here is like, hopefully you can kind of see how this is going to end up connecting to elasticity. All right, she's getting tired of Miss Rachel, so how about we try a different show? All right. I'm sorry. It is what it is. This is what happens when babysitter stuff happens. Okay. This is legal and economic tax incidents. Okay. Now, in economics, you're all good. Thanks, Tyler. Okay, in economics, you're gonna see this a lot later. But when economists say things like, we'll see later, profit, there's always a specific notion of profit that they're referring to that may not align with what a layperson considers profit to be. Okay. When economists say costs, they always are also including implicit costs like opportunity costs. Okay. When economists just say tax incidence without specifying whether it's the legal or economic type, they're always referring to the economic type. Okay. So if you ever hear just tax incidence, that means economic tax incidence, who actually bears the burden of the tax. Okay. When economists say tax incidence, they are referring to the economic type. Okay, so let's finally connect this to elasticity. So elasticity, well, not finally, I just introduced this, but elasticity and economic tax incidence. Okay, so to illustrate the idea and the distinction between legal and economic tax incidence, we're going to study a specific kind of taxes called excise taxes. To illustrate the idea of economic tax incidence, okay, we study what is called excise taxes. Excise taxes are exactly the kind of taxes that I've been using to motivate this example because it's kind of like the crown jewel example of a tax where the legal incidence and economic incidence do not often align. Okay, so X, I think I need the C after the X. Sorry, I'm sure you can hear the Mickey in the background, but whatever. Excise taxes are per unit taxes placed on specific types of goods. Specific Okay, so the example with the cigarettes is like the most famous example of an excise tax called a sin tax. Okay, a tax on something that's not particularly good for you. Okay, taxes on alcohol or taxes on cigarettes are common examples of excise taxes. They are taxes placed on specific types of goods, and they are often per unit in nature. So for each carton of cigarettes that you sell, you have to pay some amount to the government. That's the idea. Now, because these taxes are collected from the producer, they bake the tax into the price you pay. You see what I mean? So this is not like a sales tax where when the sales tax is separate, right? Where you go to the store, you pay for the good, and then the sales tax gets added on, right? An excise tax is not like that. When you pay the price of whatever it is, right, the producer is going to take that amount and use some of it to pay the tax, right? So it's baked into the price. I hope everybody understands what I mean by that. Excise taxes are included in the retail price because they are collected from producers. Yeah, okay, good. So what this means then, that statement is a little bit less obvious because you probably haven't heard of excise taxes before right now. Okay, they're included in the retail price, which means when you pay the price of a carton of cigarettes or whatever it is, okay, the tax is baked into there. Okay, and what that means, the obvious implication of that is that consumers do not realize they are paying a higher price because of the tax. Thus, consumers now, you might argue with me on that, where it's like, well, of course I understand that the price is higher because there's a tax on that good. Fair enough, right? But then you certainly don't know how much of a higher price you're paying because of these taxes. That's the idea, right? You may know that the price is higher because of taxes. I mean, we know from like week 2 of this class that taxes shift supply to the left and raise the price, right? So we know that the price is higher because of taxes, but exactly how much higher the price is because of taxes is what we don't know. Okay, that's the idea. Now, the economic burden, or you could say incidence, the economic burden of excise taxes, this is where we relate it to what we're doing right now, depends on the relative elasticity of supply and demand. Okay? That's the idea. Now, the reason for that is what I've already motivated before. Although the legal incidence falls on producers, producers have to pay the tax. They can charge a higher price and therefore shift that burden onto consumers. Now, the ability of the producer to raise the price depends on the elasticity. If demand is extremely elastic, for example, then good luck raising the price. Because if you try to raise the price, consumers just aren't going to buy any. Okay, you see what I mean? So although the legal tax incidence is on producers, some of this burden can be shifted to consumers. Okay, that's the idea. So when a firm sees, okay, I have to pay a tax now, okay, they're going to think, how can I get the consumer to pay as much of this tax as possible? How can I shift this tax onto consumers? Now, hopefully you can see that even though you shift the economic burden onto consumers, it's still the case, right? It's still the case that it's the firms who have the legal incidence. Does everybody see what I mean by that? Suppose, for example, that a carton of cigarettes is $5. And the government comes along and says, we're placing an excise tax of $2 per unit on cigarettes, right? The firm or the gas station, whoever it is, might say, look, I'm going to raise the price now to $7, right? I'm going to make the consumer pay $7. They have then shifted the entirety of the burden of that tax onto consumers who now pay the firm $7, but it's the firm who still has to pay $2 to the government. Do you see what I mean? So that's why there's a distinction between legal and economic tax incidents. Okay, the legal incidents cannot be shifted. It's only the economic incidents that can be shifted. Exactly. Now they raise the price so they don't eat the cost. Now, so that's exactly the point, Steve, is that yes, they want to raise the price so that the consumer ends up eating some of those costs. But whether or not they can do that depends on how elastic demand is. You see what I mean? Because if demand is extremely inelastic, like it is for addictive goods like cigarettes, then you can raise the price and have the consumer eat those costs, right? But if the demand for the good is very elastic, right? So demand looks like this, then you cannot raise the price because raising the price will just completely tank your sales. You see what I mean? So the firm wants to pass off the cost onto consumers, but it's possible that the firm ends up having to eat it themselves. And we're going to see what that looks like right now. Okay, so the effect of excise taxes on a market. The effect of excise taxes a market. Kind of skewed off that much. Okay, so let's draw a market of supply and demand here. This graph is going to be important, so I want to make sure we spend a little bit of time making sure that this looks good. Quantity, price. All right, switch and shows. Okay, so supply. Demand. That's easy. That's just supply and demand. Now I put exact numbers in there because the exact numbers are going to be important here. Okay, so there's supply and demand. So originally, let's look at originally what the situation here is. So originally we have equilibrium at P0 equals 25 and Q0 equals 50. Okay, that's the original equilibrium. Now, in this case, if we go ahead and compute the surpluses here, so consumer surplus is going to be this triangle up here, right? And what we can see is that that's going to be 50 times 25 divided by 2, okay, the area of that triangle. So it's going to be 25 times 25, which is 625, okay? Producer surplus is going to be symmetric. You can see it's going to be 50 times 25 divided by 2. And that's going to leave total surplus, which is going to be the sum of those two things. So 1250, like so. Okay, boom, there we go. Now, let's suppose that we levy an excise tax in this market. Okay, suppose an excise tax of $10 per unit. $10 per unit is levied on this product. Okay. Suppose an excise tax of $10 per unit is levied on this product. Now, what does this mean? It means that every time a firm sells a unit of the good now, okay, they must pay $10 to the government. That's what this is saying. Okay. Every single unit they sell, they must pay $10 to the government. So now producers must pay $10 to the government for every unit sold. Now, what this does is it creates an extremely important relationship that I'm going to define right here. Okay. And this extremely important relationship looks like this: what we call P tax minus 10 equals PP. Okay. This is the relationship that it creates. This P tax right here, this is the price paid by the consumer. Price paid by consumer, which can be thought of as the retail price. Okay, so if a price of carton of cigarettes is let's say, well, $10, like that's an unreasonable tax. I mean, let's just keep talking about it for the hell of it, just because that's what I started with. But like, obviously, that's unrealistic at this point. But if, for example, that you go to the gas station and a carton of cigarettes is $20, that's P tax. Okay, it's just the retail price that consumers pay. I call it P tax because it's the price, the equilibrium price after the tax. Okay. Then you have this $10, which is the tax. You take the price the consumer pays, you subtract off the tax, and that leaves you with PP, which is the amount that is kept by producer per unit, okay, after paying the tax. Okay. Does everybody see the idea? So if you go to the store and you see $20 for a carton of cigarettes, that's P-tax. If the tax is then $10, then when you pay $20 to the gas station to get that carton of cigarettes, right? The gas station takes $10 of that and pays the government, which leaves them with $10 as PP. Okay, does that idea make sense to everybody? This equation is really important for understanding what an excise tax is doing. Is this good? So because of this, you sometimes see the language used that the tax creates a wedge. Sometimes you hear that language used, a wedge between the price received by the producer and the price paid by the consumer. Okay? Good? Questions? Okay, so what this is going to do, so what is this tax going to do to the market? Well, we know from earlier that taxes shift supply to the left. But here, because we have a $10 tax, we know exactly how much supply is going to shift. In particular, we know that the tax shifts the supply curve upward by $10. Okay. Exactly upward by $10. Now, what is happening here? For example, if we look at the supply curve, right, at a quantity of 50, we can interpret this supply curve as saying at a quantity of 50, the firm is willing to sell that 50th unit for a minimum of $25. Okay. That's the lowest that they would sell the 50th unit for. Now, if you put a tax of $10 on that product, they're not going to be willing to sell it for $25 anymore. Why? Because they're going to have to send $10 of that to the government. Now, for that 50th unit, they're going to require at least $35 for producing that unit and selling that unit, right? Because after they send $10 to the government, then they'll be left with the $25 that they wanted for that unit. Does everybody see what I mean? So it's going to shift the supply curve exactly upward by $10. And that is because a $10 tax increases the cost of production by $10 per unit. Okay. So it's going to shift it exactly upward. So what I'm going to do now is, at the risk of getting extremely laggy with my OneNote. I'm going to copy this down so I don't have to. All right, nice. Okay, so it's going to shift this exactly upward by $10. Okay, so now when we shift it upward, we're going to call this S plus tax, like that, right? And it's going to give us a new equilibrium pricing quantity. This new equilibrium price is what P tax is. This is just the retail price. And I'm giving this number here, which is $30, right? And then this quantity is lower. We'll say it is 40. And that is what we call Q tax. Okay. So now the new equilibrium in this market
Could you scroll up 1 second?
Yeah. Good. Thanks, Jaylee. Okay, so the new equilibrium is going to happen where P tax of 30, Q tax of 40, and now notice, okay, what this means is after the tax is put in place, if you go to the store and look at the price at the store, it's $30, and there's 40 units that are transacted in the market. But when consumers pay $30, firms do not get to keep that whole amount. They only get to keep 30 minus whatever the tax is, right? That's the whole point of this formula here, right? The amount kept by producers after paying the tax is that retail price minus the tax of $10, right? Which means PP is going to be right here, which is exactly this distance of $10, okay? And so PP is going to be right here, and it is going to be 20. Okay. So this distance between these, this is the tax, right? Because it shifts upward exactly by the amount of the tax, right? So at this point, it's going to shift upward by $10. At this point, it's going to shift upward by $10, right? Because at every unit, they're now going to require $10 more to produce and sell that unit. Okay, so there's PP. Okay, now with this tax in place, that means that the last thing I have to say is that PP equals 20. Okay, now with this tax in place, the government is now going to collect some tax revenue. Okay, the government is going to collect tax revenue, and it is going to be equal to the per unit tax times however many units are sold. So the government is going to collect tax revenue equal to the tax times Q tax. Okay, which in this case, the tax is $10, Q tax is 40, so the government tax revenue is $400. Okay, now on the graph, you can visualize that. Let's use green. Because if the government collects tax revenue equal to the tax times Q tax, that is exactly this area right here. See? Because this height is the tax. This width is Q tax. So the area of that rectangle is tax times Q tax, and that's the government tax revenue. Okay. Now we can look at the welfare implications of this. We can look at consumer and producer surplus. Okay. Now we can see that consumer surplus is the area between the demand curve and the price up to however many units are purchased. Right. So consumer surplus is going to be this area here. And that is equal to what? The height is 20, and then the base is 40. So 20 times 40 is 800, divided by 2 is 400. So the consumer surplus is equal to 400, right? In this case, the producer surplus is the area between the price that producers receive after paying the tax and the supply curve that reflects what they were willing to sell it for absent of the tax, right? So the producer surplus is going to be this area down here. You look at the original supply curve because that PP reflects what the firm receives with no tax due. They are literally getting $20 that they can do whatever they want with. It's as if the tax didn't exist once they get that $20. Okay, so you compare that to the original supply curve, which reflected the willingness to pay absent of any tax. Okay. Now, in that case, this height is 20, this width is 40, so producer surplus is going to be 400, right? And now when we go to compute the total surplus, we see that the total surplus is going to be equal to consumer surplus plus producer surplus. But here, when we compute total surplus, we have to add in the government tax revenue. Why? Because that is some welfare that's flowing to the government. The government is getting a net benefit there. They're collecting money. So we have to add that into total surplus. So total surplus is going to be consumer surplus, producer surplus, plus government tax revenue. And that is going to be 400 plus 400 plus the tax revenue of 400. So it's going to be 1,200. Okay. Now, hopefully you can see the glaring obvious fact here, which is that when we look at the original market, the total surplus was 1,250. Here now, with the tax, total surplus is only 1,200, which means that there is a deadweight loss in the amount of $50. We lost $50 of surplus. And if we look at this graph, we can see that it's exactly this area right here. That is surplus that we had in equilibrium, right? But which we no longer have because the tax has distorted the market away from equilibrium and prevented the transaction of units of the good, which are mutually beneficial to transact. But the tax makes it undesirable for those units to be transacted, so they don't get transacted. Okay, so you get a deadweight loss. How's this? Good? So I'll do one more thing, then we'll take a break, okay, which is talk about how we calculate the burden of the tax. Okay. The burden of the tax is distributed as follows. Okay, here you can see that the original price was 25. The government puts a tax of $10 on this unit, and as a result, the price consumers pay rise to 30, which means that consumers are now effectively paying $5 of this $10 tax. You see, the consumer price has gone up by $5, which is half of the amount of the tax. So when we compute the consumer share of the tax burden, we get it's equal to P tax minus P0 divided by the tax. In other words, how much has the consumer's price increased relative to the tax? And you can see that P tax is 30 here, P0 is 25, the tax is 10, and so you're left with 50%. You express it as a percentage. Now, if consumers pay 50% of the tax, right, economically speaking, the economic incidence is that consumers pay 50%, then the producer share of burden is going to be effectively, look, if you look at the producer price, it was $25. Now, as a result of the tax, producers now only receive $20 for the good. So in other words, they lost $5, right? They basically paid $5 of the tax. So we would say it's equal to P0 minus PP divided by the tax, which in this case is going to be 25 minus 20 divided by 10, which is going to be equal to also 50%. So the consumer share and the producer share of the tax burden always add up to 100%, right? So here consumers and producers share the tax burden. All right. Break time, but I'll answer some questions. That was a lot what I just did. So does anybody have any questions? I'm going to do another example of this. Okay, because this is not enough. I'm going to do one more example. I'm going to show you an example where the consumer ends up facing more of the tax burden than producers. Okay. Questions.
If you could, my thing was muted at the very start. Can you just go to like the top of the the beginning of the note so I can take a screenshot real quick?
Yeah. So let me look. I got a bunch of stuff in that. So can you go up for 1 sec? So let me go up here. So you want to go to me to go to the very top, Tyler?
Yeah, before identifying, I'll be quick. I'll just take screenshots and write it down later.
That's why it's so laggy. Because I had my old macro notes. Okay, so here, let me go like that. Is that enough?
Yeah, that's perfect.
Okay, so Maria, where did you need me to go up, Maria?
I just got it. Perfect. Thank you.
Okay. You're good, Maria. Okay, so Maria's good. Steve says 40 times 20 equals 800 divided by 2. Area of the CS triangle. I'm not exactly. Was Steve just commenting on my math? Area of the CS triangle.
He didn't know you have to calculate the area of the triangle.
Okay. Area of CS triangle. Can you explain again how you got? Oh, okay. Oh, I see. So Steve was responding to Autumn's comment. All right. Can you explain again how you got 400 for CS? So look at this graph here. Okay. CS is the area of the triangle, the area between the demand curve and the price paid by consumers up to the quantity of units purchased. Okay. And so the area of this triangle right here is the base 40 times the height 20. So I think it's exactly what Steve said. 40 times 20 is 800 divided by 2 is 400. Sorry, he's laughing over PP. Yeah, whatever. Let's be mature, Steve. No, I'm kidding. But some people call it PS. So some people call P. If you read this in a book or something, some people call P tax PC, and they call PP PS. Now, I didn't want to do that. I did not want to use that standard because if I write and they write PS for P supply, okay, I did not want to do the PS standard because I didn't want people to get confused. Good now. Okay. So I'm gonna give my daughter some milk. So let me take a second here. Okay, I'm just gonna turn on my video and maybe zoom out of this so people can copy down whatever. And I'll be back in a couple minutes if she stops moving my table. All right, I'll be right back. All right. Can everybody hear me again? Okay. So let's do another example. Let's do another example to make sure that we're good on how these taxes are analyzed. Okay. So this is going to be excise taxes. With a greater burden on consumers. Okay, excise taxes with a greater burden on consumers. So up here, producers and consumers shared the burden of the tax evenly at 50%. Okay, now what is a market going to look like if consumers have to eat more of the cost, as Steve put it earlier? Okay, well, let's consider a market where demand is relative and supply is relatively elastic. Okay. As we're going to see, this is going to produce a situation where consumers bear more of the tax burden. Okay. So let's see what this looks like. So supply is going to be relatively flat like that, where demand is going to be quite steep like so. Okay, so here demand is relatively inelastic. Now, see, we need the word relatively here because we're comparing the elasticity of demand and supply. So here, when I say demand is relatively inelastic, I can only say that because I have another curve to compare to. Hopefully that idea, I've like said that a billion times now, so hopefully that's clear, but that's why I say relatively elastic as opposed to just elastic, okay? Price, that intercept is 50 up there, so we can calculate the surpluses. Now, the original equilibrium, I will denote in the same way, using the same notation. But I did not leave myself enough room, fortunately. And if I go to move it,
How many trends do you see? Let's count them. 1, 2, 3, 4.
okay, I have to make very few mistakes because we're very laggy. P0 equals 10 and 20. This is Q0. Okay. So the original equilibrium. P0 equals 10. Q0 equals 20. So let me, because of the question that we had, let me give you guys a minute to try and calculate consumer surplus, producer surplus, and total surplus. Okay. Because I'm just going to tell you bluntly right now, you're going to have to do this on the exam. I guarantee it. And you see this in the problem set that you need to calculate these things. You got to be able to do this. Okay. So take a second and try and calculate that.
A friend is someone you like to play with. A person is kind to you. Caitlin? Miss Rachel? Welcome. A friend is someone to have fun with and celebrate. Caitlin, happy day! What, do you want me to put a hat on? Sure.
All right. Anyone with consumer surplus? Jack, I think you missed one step. Yeah, 400. Okay. Yep, you just missed the subtracting 10 part, right? Yeah, so consumer surplus is the area of between demand and the price up to the number of units sold. So here it's going to be 40 times 20 divided by 2, that's 400. And then what about producer surplus? What do you get for that? Producer surplus. Anybody?
Did I do that right?
Yes.
How do you say friend in Spanish?
100. Sweet. Okay, good. And then that means that total surplus is trivial. It's just the addition of the two. Okay, now we're going to throw a tax at this market, same as we did last time. Okay, suppose an excise tax of $10 per unit is levied on this product. How did PS get calculated? What's the triangle? This triangle right here. Yep. Is levied on this product. Yep. Okay. Suppose an excise tax of $10 per unit is levied on this product. So again, now producers, when they sell every unit, they have to pay $10 to the government. So what it's going to do is it's going to shift the supply curve upward by exactly $10. Now they are going to only be willing to sell the good if they receive $10 more for that unit, right? So that they can get back to what they wanted, right? So now producers must pay $10 to the government for every unit sold. For every unit sold. And so you're left with that equation again, which is that P tax minus 10 equals PP. Okay. Whatever the price that consumers pay is, you have to take 10 off of that, and that's what producers get to keep. Okay. Now, what that's going to do is shift the supply curve upward by $10. Tax shifts the supply curve upward by $10. Okay, so let's copy this down.
I meant the last word. What does a friend look like? Friends look all kinds of ways and have many different colors of skin, like brown or peach. Our skin comes in so many beautiful tones. What skin color do you
All right, I
have?
just got to fix this price label here.
Is beautiful. Friends wear any type of clothes and have any type of hair. What type of hair?
Okay, boom. So it's going to shift the supply curve upward by $10. Now, in fact, you can see that you actually have to be careful when you draw this, because if it's going to shift the supply curve upward by that amount, then the new intercept is going to be here at this initial 10, right? It's quite nice how that worked. So S plus tax, like so. This is going to give us a new, oops, I don't want this PS in there, confusing us. Okay. This is going to give us a new equilibrium price right here, P tax, which is going to be equal to 18, and a new equilibrium quantity, 16, which is Q tax. Okay.
Do you like chicken?
So the new
Do you like bananas?
equilibrium has P tax equal 18,
Do you like cookies?
Q tax equals 16, and that leaves PP to be equal to 8. Okay, because if P tax is 18 and the tax is 10, then 18 minus 10 brings you right down back to the original supply curve. So PP is 8, and this distance right here is the tax. Okay, because that's the amount that the supply curve is shifting upward. Okay. Now, the government is going to collect some tax revenue. Government collects tax revenue equal to the tax times the number of units that are transacted. Q tax, that's going to be 10 times 16, which is 160. Okay. Now go ahead and try consumer surplus, producer surplus, consumer surplus, producer surplus, and total surplus. And remember that total surplus is consumer surplus plus producer surplus plus the government tax revenue. Okay. So go ahead and try those. See what you get. Oh, let me label the tax revenue on here. Okay, anybody with the consumer surplus? $256. Yep, perfect. Okay. So the consumer surplus is this area right here. Okay, we're almost there. So consumer surplus is this 256. What is producer surplus? Anybody?
Now we need to blow the bubbles. Ready? One.
Anybody for the producer surplus? $64. Very good. It's this area right here.
Now let's pretend to
Okay. So that is going to be an area of 64.
plan. Let's talk.
If you can't see that, it's because it's 8 times 16 divided by 2. It's 128 divided by 2, which is 64. And then total surplus, you need probably a calculator, maybe, but you're going to have 256 plus 64 plus 160. You should get 480. Okay. And spoiler alert, right? If you don't like spoilers, cover your ears. Total surplus was originally 500 in equilibrium, and now it is 480 in this inefficient situation here. This area right here is the deadweight loss. You can see that that is equal to 20. The difference between the $500 surplus you got without government involved and the 480 you get with the government involved. So you can actually see if you look at that triangle, the base is 4, the height is 10, 4 times 10 is 40, divided by 2 is 20. Okay. So what about the burden? Well, you can see what's going to happen here, right? The consumer price went up by $8, where the producer price only fell by $2. So consumers ended up eating a ton of this tax. Okay. So the burden of tax is distributed as a consumer share of the burden is going to be equal to, again, P tax minus P0 divided by the tax, which in this case is going to be 18 minus 10 divided by 10. So consumers actually bear 80% of the burden, where producer share of the burden is the amount that their price fell. So P0 minus PP divided by tax, which is going to be 10 minus 8 divided by 10, which is 20%. So here it was consumers that bear a larger tax burden. Consumers bear a larger tax burden than producers. Okay. And the exact reason for this is because demand is relatively inelastic. This is because, I'm sorry, you guys. Demand is relatively inelastic, while supply is relatively elastic. Okay. Now, I'm going to talk about the intuition of that right now, but hopefully you can kind of see what's happening here, which is that when demand is elastic, it means that consumers are very unresponsive to changes in the price. All right. Okay. All right, we're gonna have to call it. We actually got through a lot more than I thought we would. Equation for government tax revenue, that is this right here. All right. Tuesday. Well, I only have like a couple things left to say. Thank you. Yeah, I only have a couple things left to say. I'll say them on Tuesday, and that'll be done. But you can do effectively the entire of problem set 2. Okay. But of course the due date doesn't matter. So. Any questions before we call it? Yeah. You know, getting through an hour and 20 minutes is pretty good. And we got through everything. Yeah. No, don't be sorry. So Autumn, the problem set is due Tuesday, but you can turn it in whenever you want with no penalty. Yeah. Okay. There's probably like 2 parts of a question. I mean, the basic idea that I'm gonna say next time is just that if you have a situation where demand is relatively inelastic while supply is relatively elastic, then it's consumers that bear a larger tax burden. If it's the other way around, right? If you have a situation where demand is more elastic than supply, then it's going to be producers who bear the tax burden. I'll talk about that next time. Okay. Any other questions? I'm sorry, guys. I hope it wasn't terrible. The data assignment, yeah, that just work on it and turn it in when it's done.
Oscar? We could say, do you want to play with?
Hopefully, I don't think it was terrible today. We actually did quite a bit, so I'm happy with our progress. Okay, thanks, Jaylene. Thanks, Brian. You have a good weekend yourself. I'll see you guys on Tuesday, back in the dungeon. The good old dungeon. We do thrive in the dungeon. Up here, geez, we do not thrive at all. We just survive up here. We try. See ya, Steve.
Can I hear some more? Yeah.